So praise be to the Dark Gods. Seems that the Chaos Space Marines can risk some mortal wounds for some absolutely brutal damage buffs on every unit all the time. There's a new reactive defensive stratagem that could potentially shroud a unit from any enemy firepower outside of short range, and we've got the new profile for the Humble Bolt Gun. Let's talk more 10th edition previews with what's going on for the Chaos Space Marines. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Chaos, and Games Workshop's just dropped the Chaos Space Marine faction specific preview, giving us our first look at how these Warpborn Raiders will be functioning in 10th. Let's talk through the reveals one by one, see what's looking interesting and potentially powerful in game. Here's a quick summary of the main reveals that we've got for the Chaos Space Marines today. It's mainly broken down into a similar sort of style as we've had with the Tyranids and Space Marines before them. One major faction rule, 2 weapon profiles, 1 new stratagem, and a couple of meaningful datasheets, including perhaps their nominal faction leader. Going through those briefly, plus the free text annotations they've also got for us, it seems that their special rule is going to be something called Dark Pact. We'll take a look at that in a second, but basically that's the risk to chance some mortal wounds for either lethal hits or sustained hits on your damage. Usually looks like it'll be worth the trade, at least for your mainline damage dealers. The launch detachment that we don't know too much about so far is apparently called the Slaves to Darkness detachment. Kind of a little bit disappointing that they didn't give us the preview of the actual rule for that one. The only teaser that we did have was this annotation in the free text, saying that the detachment somehow explores the relationship between the Heretic Astartes and the Chaos Gods, granting your forces different powers depending on their patron deity. Judging by one of the stratagems that they showed off, apparently each of the stratagems also get a bonus buff depending on what god keyword your unit has that you're targeting. So I guess the Slaves to Darkness detachment will either give you the option to pick one of the 4 different deities and get an army-wide buff for it, or it might let the individual units choose the mark of the Chaos deity that they want each, and maybe they'll be able to divide up the minor buffs between themselves. Basically it looks like a reinterpretation of the current Chaos mark system. That's their initial launch detachment though. Of course we know that the Chaos Space Marine Codex is going to be coming around in around about a year's time. They said spring 2024. So I guess this time at least it's not one of the very last codexes of the edition. Otherwise we've got a weapon preview for the Helldrake Baleflamer and the Obliterators Flesh Metal Guns, a stratagem for shrouding one of your units, which looks absolutely amazing if you're playing Nurgle, and then 2 rather useful datasheets shown off, the new incarnation of Abaddon himself, plus the Chaos Legionaries, which I think is a pretty useful one to see to be honest, as they've got some generic weapon profiles, plus a fair bit of interesting stuff going on their very datasheet. Plenty of stuff to talk about then, so let's jump straight in. First up, I'd say perhaps the most interesting thing out of these reveals is the Dark Pact special rule. This one's the Chaos Space Marine faction specific special rule that they get on every single datasheet. They'll get this regardless of detachment, and it will be in addition to that Slaves to Darkness rule. The way that this works is that basically each time your unit either shoots or fights, it can choose to make a Dark Pact if it wants to, get an unnatural damage buff, but at the expense of having a small chance of taking D3 mortal wounds. This one is rather all-encompassing. You can do this literally every time any of your units either shoot and fight, and for the most part, from my initial impression, it looks like this is going to be worth using most of the time. When you get the damage buff, regardless of whether or not you pass or fail that leadership test, you get to choose either lethal hits or sustained hits 1 to add to your unit's attack profile. Lethal hits is the one where you automatically wound the enemy on 6s to hit, and compared with sustained hits, this is generally going to be the one that you want to go for if you are going to be wounding your target on a 5+. For a ballistic skill or weapon skill 3+ attack, it's usually going to give you a pretty mighty damage boost against those kind of targets. It basically equates to an extra 50% damage increase, though of course that percentage does kind of depend on just how efficient you were in the first place. Against tough armies like tank armies or knights though, this seems absolutely worth its weight in gold. Your entire army will be pretty threatening to them. It is kind of interesting so far that out of Space Marines with their Oath of Moment, Tyranids with their tailoring against monsters and vehicles, and now this, every single faction so far has an enormously powerful faction rule that seems like it's tailor-made to overcome tough targets. Just maybe seems a little bit odd that Games Workshop have their strength and toughness system, but don't seem too bothered about undermining it a bit with big rerolls or lethal hits handed out. Otherwise though, you can choose sustained hits 1, so basically exploding 6s to hit and getting an additional hit on your target. This one's typically going to be the one that you want to go for if you're wounding on a 3+ or better. For normal Chaos Space Marines hitting on 3s, this one's going to give you a 25% damage boost. I'd say that's going to be worth the risk of taking the mortal wounds for quite a lot of your own targets. Getting this every single time your unit attacks, if it's a big scary unit like some Possessed or Terminators or something, seems pretty excellent. The risk that you take if you fail the leadership test though is that you take D3 mortal wounds. Looks like from our glimpse at the Legionaries datasheet, the standard Chaos Space Marine leadership is likely to be 6 as well, what seems to be the norm for normal Space Marines, though I suspect their mortal followers might be a bit worse, cultists might be 7 maybe. For normal Chaos though, that would be around a 27% chance to fail. Take the D3 mortal wounds and likely lose a Chaos Space Marine perhaps. Just in terms of average damage taken though, that will average you around about half a wound each time you use this ability, so typically if you're handing out more damage than that, then it's usually going to be a net win. I think you'd usually still want to avoid it if you were firing a very suboptimal unit into a target that's not really intended for them. It just might not really be enough to justify its cost versus the risk. Plus if you had a unit that was really low on health and had 3 wounds or less remaining, it just might not be worth the chance of just killing your own unit outright, even if it does up its damage output in the short term. Looks like in general though it's going to be auto use for just about any big hefty thing that's making attacks. Things like a Lord of War like the Khorne Lord of Skulls or a big massed up Terminator unit seems ideal. Getting a 25% boost to your damage output, if not better, seems really quite nice. Overall, I must admit I quite like this rule. A very powerful option to have, and it genuinely has a bit of interesting play and some negativity to it. I feel like it could reward you for knowing when to use it and when to hold off. Having said that, I'm sure plenty of people will just be yelling glory to the dark gods and using this literally every time. Moving on, we've got a couple of heretical gun profiles, and first up we've got the Heldrake's Baleflamer. This one had a fairly decent damage profile, though was maybe better on the Lord Discordant in 9th edition. The Heldrake's just been kind of horribly overcosted for the damage platform for a while now, never mind when they nerfed it to make it start off the board. I'd say this incarnation of the profile maybe feels like a side grade compared with the previous. It's d6 plus 3 hits now, so an average of 6.5. That's up very slightly from 6 with Let the Galaxy Burn. It's gained ignore cover, as most flamers seem to, very nice against enemies that are hunkering down in ruins, but on the flip side it has lost 6 inch worth of range, and also lost a bit of AP now, as it's AP -1. To be honest, it looks like if you liked it before, you'll still like it now. It's perhaps a little bit less general purpose to be honest, though not by much. Perhaps one of the most interesting things about this little preview is that it does actually finally confirm the torrent weapon ability. It is just basically flamers auto-hitting as was expected. Otherwise, we've got the new profile of the Obliterators flesh metal guns. These things seem to be going down a similar sort of route to how they were used in 9th, basically having 3 different profiles, one for anti-infantry, one for anti-elites, and one for anti-tank. I guess maybe in 10th edition, with a bit more disparity on the toughness table, having that flexibility might be a little bit more valuable. I can't help but think though that it might mean that they're just not costed very efficiently for any of their damage output. I feel like if they're costed fairly, then as per now, they might just be a jack of all trades but master of none. In terms of their weapon profiles, it's not really too different to how it was before. A few numbers have been very slightly shifted around, but not really meaningfully in my opinion. All the guns still have 24 inch range. Warp Hail gets you d6 plus 3 attacks at strength 5, AP -1 and damage 1, that gets sustain hits 1. Ruinous Salvo gives you d6 shots as a blast weapon at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2, that one looks like the one for killing elite infantry. And then Focus Malice, the big anti-tank shot, I think is the one that really has the biggest value to be honest. D3 attacks at strength 12, AP -3 and damage 4. It's also got the Melter 2 special rule as well, meaning that if you're up close within 12 inches, you'll get an extra 2 damage. Just for a rough damage output, they're not really useless against anything, but they're not enormously standout either. You average 3 dead Termagants, almost 2 dead Intercessors, around about half a Terminator. The Focused Malice profile wins out just, and then against medium vehicles, things that are toughness 9 to 11, there'll be 4.5 wounds on average with that. That is assuming that you're within melter range though. Obviously efficiency is going to depend on how well they're costed. They were priced at a bit of a premium in 9th edition, we'll see how they fare in 10th. For our stratagem preview we have Dark Obscuration. This one's one from that Slaves to Darkness formation, one of the 6 available stratagems, and this one appears to be one to make one of your units tougher against enemy shooting, or potentially really throw a spanner in the works if you happen to be devoted to Nurgle. You target a Heretic Astartes unit from your army that was the target of an enemy shooting attack. No apparent restrictions, so I guess you can use that on really big vehicles if you want to as well. The primary effect is kind of annoying as it just says that you gain the stealth keyword, but annoyingly they don't actually tell us what stealth does. Given that we know the benefit of cover is a +1 to your save, and feel no pain type saves have been categorised differently, I'd guess that this is probably going to be -1 to hit by elimination, though I guess we don't have final confirmation on that yet. Even if it is just a -1 to hit at whatever gets shot, that's still pretty powerful, particularly against enemy armies that hit on a 4+, definitely a big reduction to incoming fire. To be honest though, I think the really exciting bit for this is for Nurgle units. If you select a Nurgle unit as the target of this, then it just can't be shot within 12 inches this shooting phase. Potentially, if your opponent's at somewhat long range, you've basically just turned off their entirety of their shooting, and their guns will have to go into something else. From what they said at the start, it sounds like the Slaves to Darkness detachment will be able to allow you to hand out the Nurgle keyword to certain units. I'd guess you'd probably be able to mark everything in the army that isn't already marked. Maybe the main question is how they can hand that out and exactly what to. I'd guess it might just be mixing and matching on most infantry units perhaps. This could be absolutely massive though. Say for example you had a massive block of Chaos Space Marine Terminators slogging their way up the board. This could basically just allow you to essentially turn off a turn of enemy firepower that wanted to go into them. Basically a stratagem that 100% keeps them safe this turn. If that really is this easy to access, I can't help but think that this could be a bit of a feels bad one maybe. If you're playing a very ranged heavy faction like say Guard or Tau or something, just seems like you might really struggle to be able to deal with a unit like that, unless you happen to be throwing units right up in front of the enemy unit only to get them charged next turn. I guess whether or not it sees play though might depend on how good the Nurgle buff is if it does give one, and whether or not there's something else out there that actually has a bit more value than this. Finally, we've got a couple of different datasheets for the Legionaries and Abaddon, which I'll go through quickly now. I might try and do a full unit review if I do get chance. First up, we've got the Chaos Legionaries, and we get both the front and the back of their data card this time. This is the back of it, where it shows you what weapons they can take, and it's by far the most involved unit that we've seen this for so far. Really quite a lot of war gear choices, and pretty much mirroring up with what they could take already. Maybe one interesting detail is that it confirms that certain factions will basically have an armory card in their data card deck, meaning that they don't have to literally print every single gun profile on every single card. Some things that are going to be common throughout the army look like they're just going to be reprinted in multiple places. Most stuff besides that looks at least broadly similar. Maybe one other interesting detail is that there's a heavy melee weapon noted here. Currently the kit only comes with one heavy chain axe. Looks like that's still going to be represented by the heavy melee weapon on a regular legionary, but it looks like there's also a heavy melee weapon on the sergeant as well. I'd guess that the sergeant's heavy melee weapon represents a power fist, which seems to be missing from the options here. So I guess it means your power fist and your heavy chain axe will have the same profile now. I've noticed that the sergeant's power weapon as well is also an accursed weapon too. Again, it looks like that one's going to be some consolidation of power weapons. I'd guess a fairly common profile throughout the Chaos Space Marine army. For the actual unit stat line of the card, looks like their raw stats kind of mirror the Intercessors, same objective control at OC2, same leadership at 6, and same number of attacks at 3, unless they take the chainsword for an extra 1. This data card's the first one that we get to see the basic bolt gun profile for Warhammer 40k, and to be honest, unfortunately, it is lagging quite a bit behind the Intercessor's bolt rifle still, perhaps even more so than before to be honest. It's only 2 shots out to 24 inches, hitting on a 3 at strength 4, AP 0 and damage 1. Not only is it lacking the AP that the Intercessor's bolt rifle gets, but it's also lacking the heavy keyword so you don't get any +1 to hit when stationary, and the assault keyword so you can't advance and fire it. Just seems like a worse weapon every way around. Otherwise we've got a flamer profile that still ignores cover, a couple of preview profiles for the autocannon and the Reaper chain cannon. The autocannon's kind of interesting, as again I think that's one of the first ones of those that we've seen. It's gone up to strength 9, AP -1 and damage 3. I guess strength 9 is the new strength 7 for minor anti-tank weapons like the autocannon. It'll mean that it's kind of efficient against rhinos and slightly less tough vehicles, but not so good against cracking heavies. Kind of nice to see damage 3 on it as well. Don't know whether that's going to be because it's the Reaper profile compared with a standard one, or whether that's going to be more the norm for them now to try and differentiate them as anti-tank weapons. The heavy melee weapon, whether it's representing a power fist or a heavy chain axe, looks like it's strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2, and it gets to strike with 3 attacks. And the accursed weapon looks like it's the same profile as the power sword that we saw on the Terminator Sergeant, hitting at strength 5 and AP -2. Otherwise, it looks like the Baleflamer tome is now merely a psychic shooting attack, and a fairly weak one at just 2 attacks at strength 5, AP -1, damage 1. Nothing really to write home about there. Chaos Icons now allow you to re-roll the leadership test for Dark Pacts abilities, gives them a little bit less chance of taking that mortal wound. Maybe could be handy if it's super cheap, but otherwise I think it might just be best to risk it. And finally, the unit's datasheet special rule is called Veterans of the Long War. Reroll once to wound against the enemy permanently, so that's a nice little damage boost there. And they also get to reroll wounds fully against enemy units that are on objectives. This one's kind of similar to that Gene Stealer special rule that we saw for the Tyranids. I'd guess probably quite a lot of these datasheet abilities are probably going to be duplicated over factions. Looks like Legionaries are going to be pretty excellent at scrapping over the objectives. Overall, they look decent enough as objective holders. I'd guess probably we're more likely to see them as ranged units rather than assault units. I feel like we'll just probably have better chaos units if you want to take the fight to the enemy with a bunch of damage. They really do have quite a lot of contenders for that crowded role, things like Warp Talons and Raptors and Terminators and Possessed and things. I feel like these guys could be interesting jumping out of Rhinos as well. Moving and then dropping could be a way to get them onto the objectives and get their guns to the fight. Finally, last but by no means least, we have Abaddon the Despoiler himself, maybe getting a bit of a shift from being an outright combat god of war to a bit more of a buffing character, though still looks really potent. Keywords wise, he's still got all the relevant god ones, so I guess you'd be able to target that Nurgle stratagem on him and ruin enemy shooting if you needed to. That could be pretty potent. And it does look like on the bottom right of the datasheet in the faction keywords section, it doesn't have Black Legion listed, so I guess that means that he's still going to be as he is now. You could take him with other legions and if you're running other special characters. At least from this datasheet, it implies to me that he's probably not going to lock you out of other choices. I feel like Abaddon's buffs are still pretty solid, but his defense has taken a big hit. He was kind of ridiculously hard to kill in current 9th edition, basically having one of those mechanics where you can't take more than 3 wounds in a turn. Never mind the fact that he's got a 4+ invul, cancels out 1 saving throw, and also had the Mark of Nurgle to debuff wound rolls. Now he's fairly straightforward, 9 wounds at toughness 5, a 2+ save, and a 4+ invul. He's lost a pip of toughness there. Kind of surprising really, seeing as he was just as tough as Guilliman in the last incarnation, and now there's a 4 toughness difference between the two, Guilliman on 9 and Abaddon on 5. For how you field him, it looks like he'd be a leader, so you're going to be putting him in a unit of Terminators or something, I suspect. Again, a difference from Guilliman there, who can go running around on his own with Lone Operative, provided he's got Ultramarines nearby. Damage-wise, he still looks really solid. Dracnian does an average of 13 wounds to vehicles, with a great big 8 attacks at strength 14, AP -4 and damage 3, plus has devastating wounds, so any 6s to wound generate your mortals instead, and he can still swap that out for anti-horde sweep mode with a Talon of Horus. His shooting seems to have gained sustained fire there as well, so extra hits on 6s for him. Then being the current War Master of Chaos, he gets 2 rather potent buffing rules. First up, if he attempts a Dark Pact and doesn't fail the leadership, then he gets a command point on a 2+. That one's massively worth it, and I feel like it's worth making sure he does a Dark Pact every single turn. His leadership's a 5+, so he's only going to be failing that roll 1 in every 6 times. I think the chance of taking mortal wounds on him is worth it for that CP generation. It doesn't look like that ability is actually capped per turn or anything like that, so if he does manage to shoot and then charge, you potentially get that off twice as best I can tell, unless there's anything in the core rules that still stops you generating more than 1 CP per turn from any source. Again, like the Swarm Lord that we saw the other day, that looks like a really powerful rule. Gaining a whole ton of command points looks excellent in an edition where they're so limited. Then for his main buffing rule, it's kind of interesting that Guilliman doesn't really have aura abilities these days, whereas Abaddon has his choice of 3 different ones. Looks like it's very different ways to realise a general type character. Abaddon seems to get the ability to choose between 1 or 3 different auras each turn. I'd say perhaps the single most powerful is probably the Paragon of Hatred one. That one just allows all Heretic Astartes units within 6 inches to re-roll the hit roll when they make their attacks. That's a pretty staggering damage increase, and it looks like it'll be in no way limited to things just like core units like it is at the moment. Looks like you'd be able to apply that to things like Forge Fiends and Venom Crawlers and things. Looks like you could just choose the biggest and most efficient guns in the Chaos Army. I think what makes that particularly nasty is that you can basically have lethal hits on any unit that wants it via a Dark Pact. 6s to hit can auto wound, and then you can just simply reroll everything that isn't a 6 and try and fish for them. Should give you a hefty amount of attacks that bypass the wound roll if you're going to be struggling with it. Otherwise, the next one looks very good as well. It hands out a 4+ invul save to any Astartes infantry or mounted units within 6 inches of him. Really quite a nice defensive buff, and I guess that might be the one to go for if you don't have anything meaningful to deal damage to for a turn, say if your opponent's army is hiding quite a lot. The mounted keyword is kind of interesting. My guess from the first look at that would probably be that it's going to be a common keyword to things like cavalry and bikes. I guess the bikers would be the relevant bits to Chaos Space Marines as it stands. It looks like Games Workshop really has kept keywords quite a lot more simple, cavalry and bikes may be treated the same, and it looks like things like swarms and beasts are being rolled into infantry as best we can tell so far. Finally, his last ability I guess is a bit more interesting with Chaos Space Marines, where it's just simply a reroll leadership and battle shock aura. I guess technically that could be kind of helpful for helping with your Dark Pacts and making sure that you don't take mortal wounds there. But still though, I'm just really not sure that that's really going to be worth it compared with just the extra damage boost. You're only giving yourself a reroll on a chance that's going to happen around about a quarter of the time, basically trying to mitigate 0.5 mortal wounds on average to the unit that rolls it. I guess sometimes it could be handy enough, but I just don't really see how that compares with 4 rerolls to hit, which is just going to be masses of extra damage, or potentially making your units a lot more sturdy than they have any right to be. 4+ invuls to tank enemy fire next turn. Still though, maybe not terrible if you're getting massive battle shock debuffs, and all you need to do is make sure that you're not battle shocked off an objective next turn. Still though, I do think that the 4 rerolls to hit has more value. Overall though, pretty interesting stuff so far for the Chaos Space Marines. I must admit there's not really much that I don't like in this preview. I think the Dark Pacts rule looks like really quite a nice one. A big flat army damage increase, but you might be taking a risk if you take advantage of it too much. Abaddon's a really powerful leader between generating your command points, giving you big bonuses plus decent combat stats, and a couple of fun gun profiles. Out of the rules, I feel like that stratagem is maybe just a little bit of a painful one if you were fighting against a shooting army. Absolutely great for the Chaos player, but just turning off an entire phase for an absolutely massive unit seems pretty nasty. I think for that sort of thing, I just generally prefer when it adds durability, as opposed to flat out makes the unit untargetable with almost no setup. Let me know what you make of it though. Does this preview have you excited for Chaos Space Marines in 10th? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I have done similar videos to this one for all the Space Marines and Tyranids on the days before. Hopefully I'll try and find a chance to do a bit more of an in-depth unit review for Abaddon at some point, and drill into those rules a little bit more. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you're interested in helping support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.